If you have ever walked through the older neighborhoods of Quebec City, or wandered the back lanes of Halifax, or found yourself standing in front of a stone farmhouse somewhere along the St. Lawrence River, you may have noticed something that does not quite make sense. A door, high up on a wall, sometimes on the second floor, sometimes on the third. No staircase leading to it, no balcony beneath it, no landing, no porch, no ladder. Just a door set into the stone or the brick, opening onto nothing but air. And if you stood there long enough, staring up at that door, you probably asked yourself the same question that hundreds of thousands of visitors have asked before you. Why is that there? Where does it go? Who built a door that opens to a 15-foot drop onto frozen ground? The answer, as it turns out, is not simple. It is not one answer at all, really. It is a collection of answers, layered on top of each other like the generations of wallpaper inside those same old buildings. Some of those doors were practical, some were financial, some were architectural, and some, if you believe the stories that have been passed down through families for 200 and 300 years, were spiritual, built not for the living, but for the dead. Tonight, we're going to walk through the oldest buildings in Canada, from the stone houses of New France to the wooden churches of the Maritimes, from the fur trade posts of the interior to the garrison towns of Upper Canada. We are going to open every one of those strange doors and find out what is on the other side. And along the way, we are going to uncover a version of Canadian history that most people never learn. A history of cold winters and desperate ingenuity, of superstition and pragmatism living side by side, of buildings that were never just buildings, but were arguments made in wood and stone about how to survive in a country that was actively trying to kill you. So settle in. This is going to take a while. And if you fall asleep along the way, that is perfectly fine. The doors will still be there in the morning. If this is the kind of content that helps you drift off, go ahead and hit subscribe. We put out new episodes like this every week, long, slow, detailed explorations of the strange corners of history. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Let us start where Canada itself started, at least in the European sense. Let us start in Quebec. Part 1. The Stone Houses of New France. The first permanent European settlement in what we now call Canada was not built by people who wanted to be there. That is an important thing to understand. The men who arrived at Quebec in 1608 under the command of Samuel de Champlain were not pioneers in the romantic sense. They were employees. They worked for a fur trading company, and their job was to build a habitation, a trading post, at the narrowing of the St. Lawrence River, where the indigenous peoples had been trading for centuries before any European ship appeared on the horizon. That first habitation was made of wood. Everything in early Canada was made of wood, because wood was the one thing the country had in almost obscene abundance. The forests stretched from the Atlantic coast to somewhere past the Great Lakes, and nobody at that time had any real idea how far they went beyond that. The trees were enormous. The French settlers, many of whom came from regions where the forest had been cut down generations ago, could not quite believe the size of the timber. Letters home described trees so large that 4 men could not link arms around the trunk. But wood, for all its abundance, had a problem. It burned, and in a settlement made entirely of wood, heated by open fires, lit by candles and oil lamps, surrounded by a wilderness that was dark for 16 hours a day in winter, fire was not a possibility. It was a certainty. The early habitations burned with a regularity that would be almost comic if people had not died in them. Champlain's original habitation burned. The replacement burned. The warehouses burned. The chapel burned. Everything burned, sooner or later, and the settlers rebuilt, and then it burned again. By the mid-1600s, the colonial authorities in New France had had enough. a series of devastating fires in the lower town of Quebec, where the merchants and tradespeople lived in dense wooden buildings along the waterfront, convinced the intendant Jean Talon and later his successors that something had to change. And so they looked across the Atlantic to France, to the building traditions of Normandy and Brittany and the Ile-de-France, and they began to mandate stone construction. This is where the story of the doors begins. The traditional French-Canadian house, the maison de pierre, that became the standard form of domestic architecture in the St. Lawrence Valley from roughly 1680 onward, was a specific response to specific problems. It had thick stone walls, sometimes 2 feet thick or more, built from the local limestone that was plentiful along the river. It had a steeply pitched roof designed to shed snow. It had small windows, because glass was expensive and heat was precious. And it had, almost universally, a large central chimney, or sometimes 2 chimneys, one at each end connected to massive fireplaces that were the only source of warmth in a climate where the temperature could drop to 40 below zero. These houses were built to last, and many of them did last. You can still see them today, scattered along the old Chemin du Roi, the King's Road that follows the north shore of the St. Lawrence from Quebec City to Montreal. Some of them are 300 years old, some of them are still lived in, and some of them have doors on their upper floors that open onto nothing. The most common explanation, and the most boring one, which also happens to be the most correct one in the majority of cases, is grain storage. The economy of New France was built on 2 pillars. The first was the fur trade, which brought in the money. The second was agriculture, specifically wheat farming, which kept people alive. Every habitant family along the St. Lawrence grew wheat. It was the foundation of the diet, ground into flour and baked into the heavy, round loaves of bread that were the staple food of the colony. And wheat, once harvested, had to be stored somewhere dry, somewhere cool, somewhere that mice and rats could not easily reach. The upper floors of these stone houses served as granaries. The family lived on the ground floor, close to the fireplaces, close to the animals that were sometimes brought inside during the worst of the winter. The upper floor, accessible by a narrow internal staircase or sometimes just a ladder, was where the grain was kept. And the door on the upper floor, the door that opened onto nothing, was how the grains got up there. Picture the harvest season, late August, early September, when the wheat had been cut and threshed and bagged. A cart pulls up alongside the house. A man stands on the cart bed, passing bags of grain up to another man standing in the upper doorway. Or perhaps they used a simple pulley system, a rope over a wooden beam that jutted out from the wall above the door like a small crane. The bags went up through the door and were stacked inside for the winter. When the family needed flour, they went upstairs, took a bag, brought it down, and ground it in their own hand mill, or took it to the seigneurial mill that every seigneur was required to maintain. It was purely functional. The door existed because it was easier to lift heavy bags of grain through a door on the second floor than to carry them up a narrow interior staircase. And the reason there was no external staircase or balcony was equally practical. An external staircase would collect snow. It would ice over. It would rot. It would provide a way for animals to reach the grain. Better to have just a door that could be opened when needed and closed and latched the rest of the time. This explanation covers perhaps 70% of the mysterious doors you will find on old buildings in Quebec, but it does not cover all of them, not by a long way. Part 2. The coffin doors. There is another explanation that you will hear if you talk to the older residents of rural Quebec, the people whose families have been on the same land for 10 or 12 generations. They will tell you about the coffin doors. In the 17th and 18th centuries, death was a constant companion in New France. The infant mortality rate was staggering by modern standards. Roughly 1 in 4 children died before their first birthday, and another quarter did not make it to adulthood. Women died in childbirth with terrible regularity. Men died in farming accidents, in logging mishaps, in encounters with wildlife, in the periodic wars with the English and their indigenous allies, and everyone, young and old, died of disease. Smallpox, typhus, influenza, scarlet fever, and a dozen other illnesses swept through the colony in waves, sometimes killing a quarter of the population of a parish in a single season. When someone died, the body had to be dealt with. In summer, this was straightforward enough. The body was washed, dressed, placed in a coffin if the family could afford one, or wrapped in a shroud if they could not, and carried to the parish church for the funeral mass and burial in the churchyard. But in winter, things were very different. The ground in Quebec freezes in November and does not thaw until April, sometimes May. In the deep interior, it can stay frozen even longer. Digging a grave in frozen ground is not just difficult. With the tools available in the 17th and 18th centuries, it was essentially impossible. You would need to light fires on the ground to thaw it layer by layer, and even then the work would take days. For a single grave. And if there was an epidemic, and there were always epidemics, you might need to dig a dozen graves in a week. The solution was to store the bodies, not in the house where the family lived and ate and slept, not in the barn where the animals were kept, but in a cold, dry space where the winter air would preserve the body. Naturally, until spring, when the ground thawed and a proper burial could take place. And for many families, that cold, dry space was the upper floor of the house. The upper floor door, in this context, served a very different purpose. When someone died in winter, the body was prepared, placed in a coffin, and lifted through the upper floor door using the same rope and pulley system that was used for grain. The door was then closed, and the body remained there, frozen, until the spring thaw. Sometimes there was more than one body. In a bad year, in a year when disease came through, a family might have 2 or 3 or 4 coffins stored on the upper floor, waiting for the ground to soften enough to receive them. This practice continued well into the 19th century in some rural areas. There are accounts from as late as the 1890s of bodies being stored in upper floors and attics during the winter months. The practice only really ended when most parishes acquired charnel houses, small buildings specifically designed for winter storage of the dead, or when improved tools and eventually mechanized equipment made winter grave digging feasible. The coffin door explanation carries a weight of sorrow that the grain storage explanation does not. When you look up at one of those doors now, knowing that coffins pass through them, knowing that families spent entire winters with their dead relatives, stored directly above the room where they cooked and slept and raised their children, the door takes on a different quality. It is not just an architectural curiosity. It is a reminder of how intimate the relationship between the living and the dead once was, how close death always stood to daily life, and how the architecture of survival in a harsh climate shaped not just how people lived, but how they dealt with dying. There is no way to know, looking at any particular door, whether it was used for grain or for coffins or for both, because most of them served both purposes at different times of the year. The same door that took in wheat in September might take in a coffin in January. The same rope and pulley that lifted a 100-pound bag of grain could lift a pine box with a body inside. The architecture did not distinguish between these uses. The door was just a door. What passed through it depended on the season and on what fate had decided to deliver. Part 3. The Churches of the Maritimes. Let us leave Quebec for a while and travel east to the Maritime Provinces, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island. The oldest European settlements in what is now Canada were not actually in Quebec. They were here, along the Atlantic coast, where the fishing fleets from France and England and the Basque country had been coming for decades before Champlain ever sailed up the St. Lawrence. The architecture of the Maritimes is different from Quebec. The stone houses of the St. Lawrence Valley have no real counterpart here. The Maritimes were built in wood because the people who settled here came largely from the British Isles, from Scotland and Ireland, and the north of England, and they brought their building traditions with them. They built in timber frame, in clapboard, in shingle. They built quickly, and they built light, because the early maritime settlements were precarious places, constantly threatened by French and English military expeditions, by Mi'kmaq resistance, and by the simple economic reality that fishing and farming on the rocky Atlantic coast was a marginal existence at the best of times. But the churches of the Maritimes, the oldest ones, the ones that survived from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, have their own version of the door to nowhere. And the story behind them is different again. The Anglican and Presbyterian and Methodist churches that were built in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick after the British conquest of Acadia in 1710 and the founding of Halifax in 1749 followed patterns that had been established in England centuries earlier. One of those patterns was the inclusion of a door on the upper level of the church tower, or sometimes on the upper level of the main body of the church itself, that had no external access, no staircase, no ladder, no landing. In England, these doors had originally served a practical purpose. They were used to move building materials during construction and to access the roof for repairs. In some cases, they were connected to galleries or lofts that had been removed during later renovations, leaving the door behind as a relic of an earlier configuration. In other cases, they were purely decorative, placed on the exterior of the building to create a sense of symmetry, because a blank wall was considered aesthetically unpleasing, while a wall with a door or window was considered complete. But in the Maritimes, these doors acquired additional meanings that had nothing to do with construction or aesthetics. One explanation that is particular to this region involves the funeral practices of the Protestant churches. In many maritime parishes, the dead were brought into the church for the funeral service through a separate entrance from the one used by the living congregation. This was partly practical, because a coffin is difficult to maneuver through a narrow doorway and down a church aisle, and partly theological, reflecting a belief that the dead should enter the house of God through their own path, separate from the path of the living. In some churches, this meant a side door at ground level, but in others, particularly in churches where the main floor was raised above the ground on a foundation of stone or brick, the funeral entrance was at a different level from the main entrance. And when later modifications changed the grade of the surrounding ground, or when additions to the church building blocked the original funeral path, the door was left in place but became inaccessible from the outside. It became, in effect, a door to nowhere. There is a beautiful example of this in the old St. Paul's Church in Halifax, which was built in 1750 and is the oldest surviving Protestant church building in Canada. The church has been modified many times over its nearly 300-year history, and several of its original doorways now open onto walls or spaces that were not part of the original plan. Walking through St. Paul's is like walking through a palimpsest, each layer of construction and renovation visible if you know where to look, each blocked doorway and sealed window, telling a story about a version of the building that no longer exists. Other maritime churches have doors that were associated with even older traditions that the Protestant clergy of the 18th century were not entirely comfortable with, but that persisted nonetheless among their congregations. In parts of Scotland and northern England, there was a belief that evil spirits could not turn corners. A straight path into a building was therefore a vulnerability, a highway for malevolent forces. Doors that opened onto nothing, doors that led to walls, doors that were placed at odd angles to the main entrance. All of these were understood, in folk tradition, as spirit traps, confusing barriers that would prevent evil from entering the sacred space. The clergy who came to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick from Scotland and the north of England would not have endorsed this belief officially. It smacked of popery and superstition, two things that good Presbyterians and Methodists were supposed to have left behind. But the carpenters and masons who actually built the churches were often from the same folk tradition, and they incorporated these features into the buildings as a matter of course, the way you might knock on wood or avoid walking under a ladder without really thinking about why. Some architectural historians have argued that at least a few of the mysterious doors in maritime churches are deliberate spirit traps, built by craftsmen who believed, on some level beneath their official Protestant theology, that a door to nowhere was a door that kept something out. Whether this is true or whether it is a romantic interpretation imposed after the fact by people who wanted the old buildings to be more mysterious than they actually were is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. But the doors are there, and the stories about them persist. Part 4. The Fur Trade Posts. Now let us go west and north, into the interior of the continent, into the vast territory that was once controlled not by any government, but by the fur trading companies, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, and before them by the coureurs de bois and voyageurs who paddled their canoes thousands of miles into the wilderness in pursuit of beaver pelts. The architecture of the fur trade is some of the most interesting and least studied architecture in Canada. The trading posts, scattered across the Canadian Shield, the prairies, the boreal forest, and eventually the Pacific coast, were built by men who had limited materials, limited tools, limited time, and a very specific set of requirements. A trading post needed to be defensible because relations with indigenous trading partners were generally peaceful, but not always. It needed to store large quantities of goods, both the trade goods brought in from Montreal or Hudson Bay and the furs acquired in trade that would be shipped out. It needed to house a small community of traders, clerks, laborers, interpreters, and their families. And it needed to survive the climate, which in most of the fur trade territory meant winters that made Quebec look mild by comparison. The classic fur trade post was built using a technique called poteau sur sol, or post on sill construction. Vertical logs were set into a horizontal sill log at the base, creating walls that were strong but could be erected quickly by a small crew. The gaps between the logs were chinked with moss, clay, or a mixture of both. The roof was made of bark, or later of wooden shingles. The whole structure could be built in a matter of weeks by half a dozen men, which was important because trading posts were frequently relocated as beaver populations were hunted out and new trading territories opened up. These posts had doors on their upper floors, and the explanation is almost always the same one we encountered in Quebec: storage. The upper floors of trading posts were warehouses, and the goods stored there, bales of fur worth enormous sums of money, needed to be moved in and out efficiently. The doors on the upper floors were loading doors, used with rope and pulley systems, or sometimes with simple ramps made of logs that could be set up when needed and removed when not. But there is one category of fur trade building that has doors with a stranger story. These are the bastions, the defensive towers that were built at the corners of the larger and more important trading posts. Posts like York Factory on Hudson Bay, or Fort William on Lake Superior, or Fort Garry at the junction of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, had fortified enclosures with bastions at the corners, small square or hexagonal towers that rose above the palisade wall and allowed defenders to fire along the wall in case of attack. These bastions typically had 2 levels. The lower level was at the height of the palisade wall and could be reached from the wall walk, the narrow platform that ran along the inside of the palisade. The upper level was above the wall and could only be reached by a ladder or trap door from the lower level. And the upper level almost always had a door, a full-sized door that opened outward from the bastion onto empty air, high above the ground outside the palisade. The military purpose of this door is debatable. Some historians have suggested it was a gun port, enlarged to door size to allow a small cannon to be maneuvered into position. Others have suggested it was an escape route, a door that could be reached by a ladder from outside in case the defenders needed to evacuate the bastion in a hurry. Still others have argued that it was simply a construction artifact, a door that was used during the building of the bastion to move materials to the upper level and was left in place afterward because removing it would have weakened the wall. But the most interesting theory, and the one that has the most evidence behind it, is that these doors were observation posts. In the flat, open landscape of the prairies and the Hudson Bay lowlands, height was a precious commodity. Even a few extra feet of elevation could extend your line of sight by miles. The upper door of a bastion, when opened, gave the lookout an unobstructed view of the surrounding terrain. He could stand in the doorway, protected by the walls of the bastion on three sides, and scan the horizon for approaching canoes, dog sled teams, war parties, or the supply brigades that arrived once a year from Montreal or from the ships that anchored in Hudson Bay. In this reading, the door to nowhere was actually a door to everywhere. It was the point from which the entire surrounding landscape could be observed and controlled. It was the eye of the trading post, the vantage point from which commerce and defense were managed. And when you stand in one of the surviving bastions today, at Lower Fort Garry in Manitoba, or at the reconstructed Fort William in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and you open that door and look out over the land, you understand why they put it there. The view is extraordinary. You can see for miles. And in a world without telephones, without roads, without any communication faster than a man could paddle or walk or ride, seeing for miles was the difference between being surprised and being prepared. Part 5. The Loyalist Houses of Upper Canada. After the American Revolution ended in 1783, a great migration began. Tens of thousands of people who had supported the British side during the war, who had fought for the crown, or who had simply refused to support the rebellion, found themselves on the losing side. Their property was confiscated. They were harassed, threatened, sometimes attacked, and they left. They left New York and Pennsylvania and the Carolinas and Massachusetts, and they went north to the remaining British colonies. Some went to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and some went west to the unsettled land north of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie that would eventually become the province of Ontario. These Loyalists, as they called themselves, or Tories, as their former neighbors called them, brought with them the architectural traditions of the American colonies they had left behind. And those traditions included a type of door that has puzzled observers in Ontario ever since. The classic Loyalist house in Upper Canada was built of either stone or timber frame, depending on what was available locally. In the Kingston area, where limestone was plentiful, stone houses predominated. Along the north shore of Lake Ontario and in the Niagara region, timber frame with clapboard siding was more common. But regardless of the material, many of these houses shared a common feature: a door on the second floor, usually on the gable end of the house, that opened onto nothing. In the American colonies, particularly in New England and the mid-Atlantic states, these doors had been associated with a specific architectural feature, a connected barn. The New England connected farm, sometimes described by the children's rhyme, big house, little house, back house, barn, was a complex of buildings linked together so that a farmer could move from his house to his barn without going outside in winter. The door on the second floor of the house connected to the upper level of the adjacent building, which in turn connected to the next building, and so on, all the way to the barn. When the Loyalists came to Upper Canada, they built their houses with these second-floor doors out of habit, out of architectural memory, out of the assumption that eventually they would build the connected complex that the door was meant to serve. But in many cases, they never did. The connected barn was a feature of established prosperous farms in settled communities. The Loyalists in Upper Canada were starting over in the wilderness. They had to clear land, plant crops, build basic shelter, and survive. The elaborate connected farmsteads of New England were a luxury that most of them never achieved in their lifetimes. And so the doors remained, doors that had been built in anticipation of a building that was never constructed, doors that represented an intention, a plan, a hope for a future that did not materialize. The Loyalist who put that door in his second-floor wall was saying, in effect, that he planned to prosper. He planned to build a barn and a workshop and a summer kitchen and to connect them all together into a complex that would rival the farm he had left behind in Connecticut or New York. The door was an act of optimism, a commitment to a future that the war and the wilderness and the harsh realities of frontier life might or might not allow him to achieve. Some of them did achieve it. There are connected farmsteads in eastern Ontario that were built by Loyalist families over 2 or 3 generations, each generation adding another building and connecting it to the one before, until the original second-floor door finally had something to connect to. But many others never got that far. The door remained a door to nowhere, a promise that was never kept, and over time the reason for it was forgotten, and it became just another odd feature of an old house that nobody could explain. There is something deeply Canadian about this, if you think about it. A door built in hope, left in place through indifference, and eventually accepted as just the way things are. It is a very Canadian approach to architecture and to life. You build for the future you want, and if the future does not cooperate, you do not tear the door out. You just stop thinking about it. You paint over it every few years. You tell your children that it was always there and you are not sure why. And eventually it becomes part of the story of the house, part of the story of the family, part of the story of the country. Part 6. The Garrison Towns. The British military presence in Canada lasted, in one form or another, from the conquest of New France in 1760 to the withdrawal of British regular troops in 1871. Over that century and more, the British Army built an enormous amount of infrastructure across the colony. Forts, barracks, magazines, hospitals, officers' quarters, guardhouses, storerooms, and all the other buildings required to maintain a military force in a distant and frequently hostile territory. Much of this architecture has survived. Kingston, Ontario, is sometimes called the Limestone City because of the number of military buildings constructed from local limestone that still stand there. Halifax has the Citadel, the massive star-shaped fortress that dominates the city's skyline. Quebec City has the Citadel and the walls and the batteries that ring the old town. And scattered across southern Ontario and the Maritimes are dozens of smaller military installations, some ruined, some restored, some converted to other uses, that preserve the distinctive features of British military architecture in colonial Canada. These buildings are full of doors to nowhere, and the reasons are almost entirely practical. Military storehouses, called magazines when they stored ammunition, and commissariat buildings, when they stored food and supplies, were designed to move large quantities of material in and out as quickly as possible. In wartime or during a military crisis, the speed with which supplies could be distributed might literally determine whether a garrison held or fell. And so these buildings were designed with multiple loading doors on every level, each one wide enough to pass a barrel or a crate, each one accessible from the outside by a temporary ramp or crane. The ammunition magazines are perhaps the most interesting. A magazine had to be fireproof, or as close to fireproof as 18th and 19th century technology could manage. It was typically built of stone, with a vaulted stone or brick ceiling, a copper-clad wooden floor. Copper does not spark when struck, unlike iron, and ventilation openings that were screened to prevent sparks from entering. The door on the upper level of a magazine was used to lift powder barrels into the building using a crane made of non-ferrous metal, again to prevent sparks. The crane has long since been removed from most surviving magazines, but the door remains high up on the wall, surrounded by stone, opening onto the air. In Halifax, the Citadel has several buildings with these upper-level doors, and guided tours often include them as a point of interest. But the most dramatic examples are at Fort Henry in Kingston, Ontario, where the restored fort preserves a number of magazines and storehouses with their original loading doors intact. Standing inside one of these buildings, looking up at a door that opens 12 or 15 feet above the ground, you can almost hear the shouted commands, the creak of the crane, the thump of barrels being swung through the doorway and lowered to the floor. There is another category of military door that deserves mention, and this one is genuinely unsettling: the execution door. In several British military installations in Canada, the upper floor of the guardhouse, or the prison building, has a door that opens onto the parade ground at a height of 6 to 8 feet. This door, in at least some documented cases, was used for military executions by hanging. The condemned man was brought to the door, the noose was placed around his neck, and he was pushed or dropped through the doorway. The height of the drop was calculated to break the neck, though this did not always work as intended, and some executions were prolonged and terrible affairs. There were not many military executions in Canada. The historical record documents only a handful during the entire period of British military occupation, but the doors remain, and the stories attached to them are the most disturbing of all the stories of Canada's doors to nowhere. They are doors that led somewhere very specific, and the place they led was death. It is difficult to stand in front of one of these doors without feeling the weight of what happened there. The parade ground is usually a quiet, grassy square now, sometimes with a flagpole, sometimes with a cannon or two, displayed as historical artifacts. Children run across it. Tourists take photographs, but the door is still there, up on the wall, and if you know what it was used for, the parade ground looks different. It looks like what it once was, which was a place where a man's life ended, in public, in front of his fellow soldiers, as a demonstration of military discipline and imperial authority. Part 7. The Ice Houses and Root Cellars. We have been talking about doors on the upper floors of buildings, but there's another category of Canadian door to nowhere that goes in the opposite direction. Down, into the ground. The ice house was one of the most important structures on any substantial Canadian property from the 17th century well into the 20th. Before mechanical refrigeration became widely available in the early 1900s, the only way to preserve food in warm weather was with ice. And in Canada, ice was one resource that was never in short supply. Every winter, when the rivers and lakes froze solid, teams of men would go out with saws and axes and cut blocks of ice from the surface. These blocks, which could weigh several 100 pounds each, were hauled by horse-drawn sled to the ice house, a building that was usually partially or fully underground, insulated with sawdust or straw, and designed to keep the ice frozen for as long as possible through the spring, summer, and fall. The ice house typically had a door at ground level for access, but it also frequently had a second door higher up that opened from the outside at a level well above the ground. This door was used during the loading process. When the ice blocks were being brought in, they were stacked from the bottom up, and as the stack grew higher, the lower door became inaccessible. The upper door allowed the ice to continue to be loaded after the lower portion of the building was full. When the ice house was fully loaded and the upper door was closed and sealed. The building appeared to have a door partway up its wall that served no purpose. It looked like a mistake, or an afterthought, or a purely decorative element. But it was none of those things. It was a carefully considered feature of a building that was designed around a specific process, the process of packing a large volume of ice into a confined space as efficiently as possible. Root cellars had a similar logic, but worked in the opposite direction. A root cellar was a cold storage space built into a hillside or dug into the ground, used to store root vegetables, apples, preserved meats, and other foodstuffs that needed to be kept cool but not frozen. Many root cellars were built into the side of a hill, with a door at the front that opened directly into the earth. From the outside, these doors looked like doors set into a grassy hillside, doors that led into the ground itself. In older properties, where the landscape has changed over time, where erosion or deliberate grading has altered the shape of the terrain, these root cellar doors can end up in odd positions. A door that once opened into a hillside might now be exposed on a vertical wall where the hill has been cut away. A door that once was at ground level might now be several feet above the surrounding grade because fill has been removed. The door looks inexplicable until you understand that the landscape around it has changed while the door has stayed in place. There is a property near Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, where an 18th century root cellar door is now visible on the side of a stone wall, 3 feet above the current ground level, opening onto what appears to be solid earth. The original hillside was partially excavated in the 19th century to make room for a road, and the root cellar was cut in half by the excavation. The back wall of the cellar is now an exposed stone face beside the road, and the door, which once opened into a cool, dark storage space full of turnips and carrots and barrels of salt pork, now opens onto a few inches of packed earth and then nothing. The cellar is gone, the door remains, and unless you know the history, it looks like someone built a door into the side of a hill for no reason at all. Part 8. The French Regime Hospitals. The hospitals of New France deserve their own discussion because they contain some of the most haunting examples of doors to nowhere in all of Canadian architecture. The care of the sick in New France was largely the responsibility of religious orders. The Augustinian nuns operated the Hôtel Dieu hospitals in Quebec City and Montreal. The Ursulines ran a hospital and school in Quebec. The Grey Nuns, founded by Marguerite Duville in 1737, operated hospitals and charitable institutions in Montreal and later across the country. These women were among the most remarkable people in Canadian history, and the buildings they created reflect their extraordinary combination of spiritual devotion and practical competence. The Hôtel Dieu de Québec, founded in 1639, is the oldest hospital in North America. The original building has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, but parts of the complex date to the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and these older sections contain architectural features that speak directly to the medical and spiritual practices of the time. One of these features is the Galerie des Morts, the Gallery of the Dead. This was a corridor or passage on the upper floor of the hospital that connected the main ward to a room, or set of rooms, where the bodies of deceased patients were prepared for burial. The gallery typically had a door at each end, and sometimes a door on the exterior wall as well, and this exterior door, the one that opened onto the outside from the upper floor, was the door through which coffins were lowered to the ground for transport to the cemetery. The reason for placing this door on the upper floor, rather than simply carrying the coffins down the stairs and out the main entrance, was both practical and spiritual. Practically, the upper floor gallery allowed the bodies to be moved without passing through the ward where other patients were lying. Seeing coffins carried past your bed was not considered conducive to recovery. The upper floor route kept death separate from the ongoing work of healing, at least visually. Spiritually, the elevation of the door was understood by the nuns as symbolic. The soul ascended to heaven. The body descended to the earth. The door on the upper floor was the point of transition, the threshold between the vertical journey of the soul and the horizontal journey of the body to its resting place. This interpretation may or may not reflect the actual intentions of the builders, but it was certainly how the nuns themselves understood the architecture of their hospitals. Their writings, preserved in the archives of the Augustinian order in Quebec, describe the Galerie des Morts and its exterior door in explicitly theological terms. The door was not merely functional, it was sacramental. It was a physical manifestation of the passage from life to death, from the material world to the spiritual one. The Hôtel de Montréal, founded in 1645 by Jean Mance, had a similar arrangement, though the building has been so extensively modified over the centuries that the original configuration is difficult to reconstruct. Jeanne Mance herself is one of the most remarkable figures in Canadian history, a lay woman who came to Montreal as part of the original founding party and who spent decades running the hospital under conditions of extraordinary hardship. She performed surgery, set bones, nursed patients through epidemics, and managed the finances of the institution, all while the tiny settlement of Ville-Marie was under constant threat of attack. The hospital she built was a modest structure of stone and wood, and it almost certainly had the same upper floor door for the removal of the dead that the Quebec Hôtel Dieu had. Jeanne Mance was a practical woman, and the practical advantages of an upper floor exit for coffins were obvious. But she was also a devout woman, and the symbolic dimensions of the door would not have been lost on her. Part 9. The evolution of the door. By the 19th century, the practical reasons for doors to nowhere had largely disappeared. Mechanical grain elevators replaced the manual hoisting of grain bags. Improved tools made winter grave. Digging possible, or at least less impossible. Ice houses were superseded by mechanical refrigeration. Military magazines adopted new designs. The specific functional needs that had created these doors no longer existed, but the doors themselves remained. Hundreds of them, on buildings across the country from Newfoundland to British Columbia. And as the original reasons for them faded from living memory, new explanations arose to fill the gap. Some of these explanations were creative. In parts of Ontario, there was a story that the doors were witch doors, placed on the upper floors of houses to allow witches to enter and leave without being seen by the neighbors. This story has no historical basis whatsoever, but it persisted because it was a good story and because it gave an ordinary architectural feature a delicious air of the supernatural. In Nova Scotia, there was a story that the doors were used by smugglers who would row up to the building at high tide and pass contraband goods through the upper floor door directly from a boat. This story is more plausible in some specific locations, particularly along the coast where buildings were constructed close to the waterline and where smuggling was indeed a significant economic activity in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it does not explain the majority of the doors, which are found on inland buildings far from any navigable water. In Quebec, there was and still is a rich tradition of supernatural explanations for the doors. They were doors for the fairies. They were doors for the dead to use when they returned to visit the living. They were doors that the devil himself had demanded be placed in the house, as the price for some favor he had granted the builder. These stories are part of the broader tradition of Quebec folklore, which is one of the richest and most complex folk traditions in North America, and they deserve to be taken seriously not as explanations of the doors, but as evidence of how deeply these buildings were embedded in the imaginative life of the communities that lived in and around them. A door that leads to nowhere is, in a sense, a perfect canvas for the imagination. It is a feature that demands an explanation but resists a simple one. It invites speculation. It invites storytelling. It invites the kind of creative engagement with the built environment that produces folklore and legend and the slow accretion of meaning that turns a building from a mere structure into a place with a story. And this, perhaps, is the most important thing about Canada's doors to nowhere. They are not just architectural features. They are storytelling devices. They are invitations to wonder. They are openings, not in any physical sense, but in the sense that they open up questions about the past, about the people who built these buildings and lived in them and died in them, about the practical and spiritual and imaginative worlds those people inhabited. When you stand in front of a 300-year-old stone house on the banks of the St. Lawrence and look up at a door on the second floor that opens onto 15 feet of empty air, you're not just looking at a door, you're looking at a question. And the answer to that question is never just one thing. It is grain and coffins and pulleys and snow. It is desperation and ingenuity and faith. It is the whole complicated, contradictory, endlessly fascinating story of how people survived in a place that was not designed for human survival, and how the buildings they created in that effort became, over the centuries, monuments to the sheer stubborn persistence of the human desire to live and to die, with a roof overhead and a door that opened, even if what it opened onto was nothing but the cold Canadian air. Part 10. Specific buildings and their doors. Let us now visit some specific buildings, real buildings that you can go and see if you are inclined to plan a trip around architectural oddities, which is a perfectly reasonable way to spend a vacation. The Maison Jacquet in Quebec City is one of the oldest surviving houses in North America. It was built around 1687 on Rue Saint-Louis within the walls of the old city, and it has been continuously occupied for nearly 350 years. The house is a classic example of the Maison de Pierre tradition, with thick stone walls, a steeply pitched roof, and dormer windows that punctuate the roofline. And on the rear wall, facing what was once a courtyard and is now a narrow lane, there is a door on the upper floor that has no external access. The Maison Jacquet has been studied extensively by architectural historians, and the consensus is that this particular door was indeed a loading door for the upper floor storage space. The house was owned by a succession of merchants and artisans, people who needed storage for goods, and the upper floor was their warehouse. The door is wide enough to pass a barrel through, and there are marks on the stone above it that may indicate where a beam or bracket for a pulley was once attached. But there is a local tradition, completely unverifiable but stubbornly persistent, that the door was also used during the siege of Quebec in 1759, when the British under General James Wolfe bombarded the city for months before finally scaling the cliffs and defeating the French on the plains of Abraham. According to this tradition, the upper floor door was used to lower wounded people from the house during the bombardment, when the lower floor was on fire and the main doorway was blocked by rubble. Whether this actually happened is anyone's guess. The siege certainly did happen, and houses in the lower and upper town were certainly damaged and destroyed. But whether anyone was lowered from the Maison Jacquet's upper floor door during the siege is a matter of local legend rather than documented history. The Maison Chevalier, also in Quebec City, is another well-preserved example. Built in 1752 by the merchant Jean-Baptiste Chevalier, it is now a museum and part of the Musée de la Civilisation. The house has a particularly fine example of an upper floor loading door, complete with the iron hardware that was used to attach the pulley mechanism. The museum interprets this door as part of the commercial function of the building, which served as both a residence and a warehouse for goods imported from France. Moving west, the Ermatinger Clerge Heritage Site in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, preserves the oldest surviving stone building in northern Ontario, built in 1814 by Charles Oakes Ermatinger, a fur trader. The house is a fascinating example of the blending of architectural traditions that occurred in the fur trade country. It has features drawn from both French, Canadian, and British building practices, reflecting Ermatinger's mixed heritage, and is positioned at the intersection of two colonial cultures. The house has an upper floor door on the river-facing side that was almost certainly used for loading goods from canoes that pulled up on the riverbank below. In Nova Scotia, the Perkins House in Liverpool, built in 1766 by the New England planter Simeon Perkins, has a side door on the upper floor that is one of the most photographed architectural oddities in the Maritimes. Perkins was a Connecticut-born merchant and militia officer who kept a detailed diary that is one of the most important primary sources for the history of Nova Scotia in the late 18th century. His house, a classic New England salt box, design transplanted to the Nova Scotian coast, has the upper floor door that is characteristic of connected New England farmsteads. But Perkins never built the connected outbuildings that the door was meant to serve. The door opens onto the garden about 10 feet above the ground and has opened onto nothing for more than 250 years. In New Brunswick, the Acadian historical village near Caraquet preserves a collection of buildings from the 18th and 19th centuries that illustrate the architectural traditions of the Acadian people, the French-speaking settlers of the maritime provinces who were deported by the British in the Great Expulsion of 1755 and who gradually returned to rebuild their communities over the following decades. Several of the houses in the village have upper floor doors, and the interpreters at the site explain them as loading doors for hay and grain storage, which is almost certainly correct. In Manitoba, Lower Fort Garry, the oldest intact fur trade post in North America, preserves an extraordinary collection of buildings from the 1830s and 1840s, including the Big House, the residence of the post commander, the fur loft, the men's house, and the bastions at each corner of the stone wall that surrounds the compound. The fur loft has a magnificent loading door on its upper floor, facing the interior of the compound, through which bales of fur were hoisted for storage, before being shipped to England. The bastions have the upper floor doors we discussed earlier, opening outward over the wall, that were used as observation posts. Each of these buildings tells its own version of the same story. A door was placed where it was needed, for a reason that made perfect sense at the time. And then the time passed, and the reason was forgotten, and the door remained, stubbornly present, stubbornly inexplicable to anyone who did not know the history. Part 11. The Theology of Thresholds. There is a deeper layer to this story, one that goes beyond the practical and into the philosophical. And since this is the kind of content that you might be listening to as you drift off to sleep, this seems like a good time to explore it, because there is something inherently contemplative about the idea of a door that opens onto nothing. In many cultures, the doorway is understood as a liminal space, a threshold between one state of being and another. The word liminal comes from the Latin limen, which means threshold, and the concept of liminality, the state of being between, has been central to human thought for as long as humans have been building shelters with entrances. The Romans had an entire god devoted to doorways. Janus, the two-faced god who looked both forward and backward, who presided over beginnings and endings, who gave his name to the month of January, because January was the doorway between one year and the next. Every Roman doorway was, in a sense, a sacred space, a point of transition that required respect and sometimes sacrifice. Coins were placed under thresholds for luck. Brides were carried over doorsteps to protect them from evil spirits that might lurk at the boundary between outside and inside. Salt was thrown across doorways to purify the transition. These traditions did not disappear with the Roman Empire. They persisted in modified form throughout the Christian era and crossed the Atlantic with the European settlers who came to Canada. The folk traditions of France, of England, of Scotland, of Ireland all included elaborate beliefs and practices associated with doorways. In French Canadian tradition, the doorway was protected by a cross or a religious image placed above or beside it. The door of a house was blessed by the priest when the house was first occupied. When someone died in the house, the door was draped in black. When a child was born, the door was left slightly ajar to allow the guardian angel to enter. The door was a permeable boundary between the domestic world and the spiritual world, and the rituals associated with it acknowledge this permeability. A door that leads to nowhere in this context is not just an architectural oddity, it is a theological statement. It is a door that opens onto the void, onto the unknown, onto whatever lies beyond the walls of the familiar. It is, if you are inclined to think in these terms, a door between this world and the next. And the fact that it was used, in many cases, to pass coffins through, to move the dead from the world of the living to the world of the buried, only reinforces this reading. The nuns at the Hôtel Dieu understood this. The Scottish carpenters who built spirit traps into Nova Scotian churches understood this. The habitant farmer who lifted his dead child through the upper floor door and laid the small coffin beside the grain bags and closed the door against the January wind, he understood this too, whether he had the words for it or not. A door is never just a door. It is always a statement about what lies on either side of it and about the act of passing from one side to the other. And a door that leads to nowhere is perhaps the most honest door of all, because it acknowledges what every other door conceals, which is that we never really know what is on the other side until we step through. Part 12. The Scottish Influence. We should spend some time on the Scottish contribution to Canadian architecture, because it is enormous, and because the Scots brought with them some very specific ideas about doors that have left their mark on buildings across the country. The Scottish immigration to Canada is one of the great population movements in modern history. Beginning in the late 18th century and continuing through the 19th, hundreds of thousands of Scots left their homeland for the colonies, driven by the Highland clearances, by poverty, by the collapse of the kelp industry, by the simple mathematical reality that the Scottish Highlands could not support the number of people living in them. They came to Nova Scotia, which had been named New Scotland by Sir William Alexander in 1621. They came to Prince Edward Island and Cape Breton. They came to Glengarry County in eastern Ontario, where entire Highland communities transplanted themselves wholesale, maintaining their Gaelic language, their clan structures, and their building traditions in the forests of the New World. Scottish domestic architecture had several features that created doors to nowhere when transplanted to Canada. The most common was the hayloft door. In Scotland, the traditional croft house or farmhouse often had a byre, a cowshed attached to the main house, with a loft above the byre used for hay storage. The loft had a door on the gable end, through which hay was forked in during harvest and forked out during winter to feed the cattle below. When Scottish settlers built houses in Canada, they often replicated this layout, but the harsh Canadian winters forced modifications. The attached byre was sometimes replaced by a separate barn, because the heat from the animals, which was an asset in the mild Scottish winter, could actually cause problems in the extreme cold of a Canadian winter by creating moisture that froze on the inside walls. When the byre was separated from the house, the hayloft door on the house remained, a vestige of the Scottish design that no longer had a functional purpose. In Cape Breton, where the Scottish architectural influence is particularly strong, you can find numerous examples of houses with these vestigial or hayloft doors. The houses have been converted to modern use, insulated, electrified, plumbed, but the door on the upper gable remains, sometimes sealed, sometimes simply left as an opening covered by a piece of plywood or a shutter. There is one house near Baddeck, Cape Breton, that illustrates the Scottish influence beautifully. It was built in the 1820s by a family that had come from the Isle of Skye, and it was built according to the pattern they knew, with a central chimney, 2 rooms on the ground floor, a loft above, and a door on the gable end at loft level. The family spoke Gaelic. They organized their land according to the Scottish run-rig system. They celebrated the old Scottish festivals, and they built their house with a door that made perfect sense on the Isle of Skye, where the loft opened onto the byre, but that made no sense at all in Cape Breton, where the barn was a separate building 50 feet away. The door is still there. The house is now a summer residence, used by descendants of the original family. They have never removed the door. When asked about it, they say it has always been there, and that removing it would feel wrong, like changing something that was not theirs to change. The door belongs to the house, and the house belongs to the land, and the land was cleared by their ancestors, and so the door stays. This attitude toward old architectural features is common across Canada and is one of the reasons so many doors to nowhere survive. People do not remove them because removing them would feel like erasing something, some trace of the people who built the building, some evidence of the original intention behind the structure. The door is a connection to the past, a physical link to the hands that placed the stones or sawed the timbers, and to destroy that link would be a small act of vandalism against history itself. Part 13. The Industrial Doors. The Industrial Revolution came to Canada in the mid-19th century, later than it came to England or the United States, but with the same transformative effect. Factories, mills, warehouses, and processing plants sprang up across the country, concentrated in the urban centers of Montreal, Toronto, Hamilton, and the smaller manufacturing towns of southern Ontario and Quebec. The architecture of Canadian industry was functional in the extreme. These buildings were designed to move goods, raw materials in, and finished products out as efficiently as possible. And the loading door, the door on the upper floor that opened onto nothing but, was connected to a crane or hoist or conveyor system, became one of the defining features of Canadian industrial architecture. Walk through the old industrial districts of any Canadian city, the areas that are now being converted to condominiums and art galleries and restaurants, and you will see loading doors everywhere. In Montreal, the old port area and the Lachine Canal district are full of former warehouses and factories with rows of loading doors marching up their facades, one on each floor, each one served by a beam or bracket that once held a pulley. In Toronto, the Distillery District, which preserves a collection of Victorian-era industrial buildings, has loading doors on virtually every structure. In Hamilton, the old steel mills and manufacturing plants along the waterfront display the same feature. These industrial loading doors are the most straightforward of all Canada's doors to nowhere. Their purpose is obvious and well documented. They are loading doors. They were used to move goods. The cranes and hoists that serve them have been removed, but the function is clear from the context. But even these utilitarian doors have a certain poetry to them, if you are in the right mood to see it. Stand in front of a 19th century warehouse in Montreal's old port at dusk, when the light is fading and the tourists have gone and the cobblestone streets are quiet, and look up at a row of loading doors on a stone facade. Each door is dark, open onto shadow. Each one is identical to the others. They march up the face of the building like a column of blind eyes, seeing nothing, opening onto nothing, serving a purpose that ended a century ago. There is a warehouse on Rue de la Commune in Old Montreal that has 7 loading doors, one on each of its 7 floors, and all 7 are still intact, still fitted with their original iron hardware. still capable of being opened and closed. The building is now a hotel, and the loading doors have been converted to windows in the guest rooms, but on the outside, looking up from the street, they still read as doors. Doors that once opened to receive bales of cotton or barrels of molasses or crates of manufactured goods from England, and that now frame the faces of tourists looking out at the river and wondering about the building they are sleeping in. The conversion of loading doors to windows is one of the most common fates of Canada's doors to nowhere. When old buildings are renovated for residential or commercial use, the upper floor doors are often glazed, fitted with glass instead of the original wooden panels, and converted into windows that retain the proportions and framing of the original doors. From the outside, they still look like doors. From the inside, they are windows. They are both and neither, which is a fitting ambiguity for a feature that has always resisted simple categorization. Part 14. The question of preservation. Canada has a complicated relationship with its architectural heritage. On one hand, there is a strong tradition of heritage preservation, supported by federal and provincial legislation, by organizations like Parks Canada and the Heritage Canada Foundation, and by local heritage committees in municipalities across the country. On the other hand, Canada is a young country with a deeply ingrained bias toward the new, and old buildings are regularly demolished to make way for development, parking lots, and road-widening projects. The doors to nowhere are, in a sense, test cases for the broader question of heritage preservation. They are features that have no current function. They serve no practical purpose. They are, from a strictly utilitarian perspective, liabilities. An unsealed door on an upper floor is a source of heat loss, water intrusion, and structural vulnerability. A rational building owner might reasonably argue that the door should be sealed, bricked up, or removed entirely, and yet the doors persist. They persist because people recognize, even if they cannot articulate it, that these features have a value that goes beyond the practical. They are evidence of the past. They are traces of lives lived and decisions made and problems solved by people who are no longer here to explain themselves. They are, in the language of heritage preservation, character-defining elements, features that contribute to the historical significance and visual identity of a building. The standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada, published by Parks Canada, specifically address the treatment of features like doors to nowhere. The guidelines recommend that such features be retained and conserved, even when they no longer serve their original function, because their removal would diminish the building's ability to tell its own story. A door that has been bricked up is a door that has been silenced. A door that has been removed is a door that has been erased, and in either case something is lost, not just the door itself, but the questions it provokes and the stories it invites. Some property owners have found creative ways to preserve these doors while addressing the practical concerns they raise. In Quebec City, several owners of old houses have installed glass panels in their upper floor doors, allowing light into the upper floor while maintaining the visual presence of the door on the exterior. In Kingston, Ontario, the owners of a former warehouse have converted the loading doors into balcony doors by adding small iron balconies, a solution that gives the doors a new function while preserving their original proportions and position. These solutions are not without controversy. Purists argue that adding a balcony to a loading door fundamentally changes the character of the feature, turning a door to nowhere into a door to somewhere, and thereby destroying the very quality that made it interesting in the first place. Others argue that the alternative is worse, that if the door cannot be made functional, it will eventually be sealed or removed, and that a modified door is better than no door at all. This debate mirrors the larger debates in heritage preservation about the balance between authenticity and adaptation, between preserving the past exactly as it was and allowing it to evolve and change in response to new needs and new circumstances. There is no easy answer, but the doors themselves, hanging there on their ancient hinges, opening onto the Canadian air, seem to suggest that sometimes the best answer is the simplest one. Leave it alone. Let it be what it is. A door that leads to nowhere is, in its own way, perfect. Part 15. The doors we build today. It would be comforting to think that the era of the door to nowhere is over, that modern architecture, with its emphasis on function and efficiency and building codes, has eliminated the possibility of a door that opens onto empty space. But that is not entirely true. Modern buildings have their own versions of the door to nowhere, fire escape doors that are required by code, but that open onto drops that would require a ladder truck to make usable. Maintenance access doors on the roofs of commercial buildings that can only be reached from the inside. Emergency exit doors in parking garages that open onto retaining walls. These doors exist because the building code requires them, and the building code, like any set of regulations, sometimes produces results that look absurd in practice, even if they make sense on paper. There is a building in downtown Toronto, a residential tower built in the early 2000s, that has a door on the 43rd floor that opens onto nothing. It is a maintenance access door for the building's facade cleaning system, and it is intended to be used only by workers in harnesses attached to a suspended platform. But if you open the door without the platform in place, you would step out into 400 feet of empty air above the city. In a sense, this door is the direct descendant of the loading doors on the fur trade posts and the grain storage doors on the farmhouses of New France. It exists for a specific, practical purpose. It opens onto nothing most of the time, and it would look, to anyone who encountered it without context, like a mistake. 300 years from now, if the building is still standing, someone might look at that door and wonder why it was there. They might invent stories about it. They might imagine that it was a portal, or a punishment, or a philosophical statement about the nature of urban life. They would be wrong, of course. It is a maintenance door. But being wrong about doors is a Canadian tradition with a long and honorable history, and there is no reason to think it will end anytime soon. Part 16. The Acadian Doors. We touched briefly on the Acadian people earlier, but their story and their architecture deserve a more thorough exploration, because the Acadians experienced something that no other European settler community in Canada experienced, and it left a mark on their buildings that is visible to this day. The Acadians were the French-speaking settlers of what is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. They arrived in the early 17th century, beginning with the establishment of Port Royal in 1605, and over the next century and a half they developed a distinctive culture that was adapted to the specific conditions of the maritime environment. They built dikes to reclaim marshland from the sea. They developed agricultural techniques which suited to the tidal flats. They maintained a complex network of trading relationships with the Mi'kmaq people, and they built houses that reflected their particular needs and their particular sense of how a building should relate to the landscape. Then, in 1755, the British colonial authorities decided to remove them. The Great Expulsion, le Grand Dérangement, was one of the most traumatic events in Canadian history. Over the course of several years, approximately 10,000 Acadians were rounded up, put on ships, and deported to destinations scattered across the Atlantic world, from the American colonies to France to the Caribbean. Families were separated, communities were destroyed, houses, barns, churches, and dikes were burned by British soldiers to prevent the Acadians from returning, but some did return. Beginning in the 1760s, after the Treaty of Paris ended the 7 Years' War, and the British grip on the Maritimes was secure enough that the Acadians were no longer considered a military threat, small groups of deportees began making their way back to their homeland. They found their communities destroyed, their lands occupied by English-speaking settlers, and their former way of life gone. The houses that the returning Acadians built were different from the houses they had left behind. They were smaller, poorer, built with fewer resources and less time. They were built quickly because the returning families needed shelter immediately, often arriving in the late summer or fall with winter approaching. And they were built with a particular feature that the pre-expulsion Acadian houses had not had: a door on the upper floor, or sometimes just a large opening in the gable end that opened onto the outside. The explanation for these doors is straightforward. The returning Acadians had lost everything. They had no barns, no storehouses, no outbuildings. They had their house and nothing else. And so the house had to serve every function: dwelling, barn, storehouse, workshop, all in one structure. The upper floor was used for storage and sometimes for housing animals during the worst of the winter, and the door on the upper floor was the way materials and animals were moved in and out. But there is another dimension to these doors that is particular to the Acadian experience. For a people who had been forcibly removed from their homes, the act of building a door, any door, was an act of defiance. A door implies permanence. A door implies that you intend to stay. The British had burned their doors and put them on ships and sent them away, and now they were building new doors, not just the front doors that everyone could see, but doors on every level, doors that said, in effect, we are here, we are staying, and we are going to need more room, because we plan to prosper. The upper floor doors of the Acadian houses built after the Great Expulsion are, in this reading, not doors to nowhere. They are doors to the future. They are doors that say, we are going to fill this space with grain and with goods and with the products of our labor, and we are going to need this door to get it all in, because we are going to have more than we can carry up the stairs. This interpretation may seem like a romantic overlay on a purely practical feature, and it probably is, but the Acadians themselves have always understood their architecture in these terms, as statements of identity and persistence, as physical evidence of their refusal to disappear. The Acadian flag, the Acadian national holiday, the Acadian language, these are all forms of cultural assertion, ways of saying we are still here. And the doors of their houses, including the doors that lead to nowhere, are part of that assertion. Part 17. The Cold and the Dark. We should talk about winter. We have mentioned it many times already, because you cannot talk about Canadian architecture without talking about winter. But we have not really talked about what winter was like for the people who lived in these buildings, and understanding that experience is essential to understanding why the buildings look the way they do. Winter in Canada in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries was not what winter is now. It was not a season to be managed with insulated walls and central heating and Gore-Tex jackets. It was an existential threat. It was the thing that could kill you. And for 6 months of the year, from November to April in the south, and from October to May in the north, every aspect of daily life was organized around the single imperative of not dying of cold. The houses were cold, even with fires burning constantly, even with thick stone walls, even with every crack sealed with moss and clay. The houses were cold. Contemporary accounts describe ice forming on the inside of the walls. Water left in a bucket beside the fire would freeze overnight. Ink froze in the inkwell. Wine froze in the bottle. The bread, baked in the morning, would be frozen solid by nightfall if left on the table. People slept in their clothes. They slept under piles of blankets and furs. They slept with hot stones wrapped in cloth, placed at the foot of the bed. They slept with their animals, because the body heat of a cow or a horse, or even a few chickens, could make the difference between a survivable night and a dangerous one. In this context, every door was a vulnerability. Every door was a place where cold air could enter and warm air could escape. And so, doors were made as small as possible, as tight-fitting as possible, as well-sealed as possible. The front door of a typical habitant house was low and narrow, requiring even an average-sized person to stoop slightly to enter. This was not because the inhabitants were short. It was because a small door lost less heat than a large one. The upper floor doors, the doors that opened onto nothing, were a particular concern. When they were in use, during the harvest season or during the grim business of storing winter dead, they were open only briefly, and the cold air that rushed in was a temporary inconvenience. But when they were not in use, they had to be sealed absolutely. A poorly sealed upper floor door could drain the heat from the entire house, and in the depths of a Canadian winter that could be fatal. The methods used to seal these doors were various and sometimes elaborate. Some were fitted with heavy wooden shutters on the inside, bolted shut and packed around the edges with cloth or moss. Some were covered on the outside with boards nailed directly over the door frame, creating a double barrier. Some were sealed with a mixture of cow dung and clay that hardened in the cold and had to be chipped away in the spring before the door could be opened again. The seasonal rhythm of these doors, open in summer and fall, sealed in winter, open again in spring, gave the buildings a kind of breathing quality, as if the house itself was alive, and its doors were lungs that opened and closed with the changing seasons. In summer, the building was open and permeable, connected to the world outside. In winter, it was sealed and closed, a fortress against the cold, every opening battened down, every crack sealed, every door shut tight against the wind that came howling down from the north with a force that could literally take your breath away. This seasonal opening and closing of the doors also meant that the doors aged differently from the rest of the building. The areas around the doors were subject to more wear, more weathering, more freeze-thaw damage than the rest of the wall. And so the doors often became the weakest point in the structure, the place where the stone cracked first, where the mortar crumbled first, where the wood rotted first. Many of the doors that have disappeared from old Canadian buildings were not deliberately removed. They simply fell apart, victims of the same climate that had created the need for them in the first place. The doors that survive are the ones that were well maintained, or that were located on the sheltered side of the building, or that were lucky enough to be on buildings that were valued and cared for by their owners. Each surviving door is a small miracle of persistence, a testament to the quality of the original construction and to the accumulated care of generations of people who understood, whether they could have articulated it or not, that the door was worth keeping. Part 18. The Doors of the Churches of Quebec. We discussed the churches of the Maritimes earlier, but the churches of Quebec are their own story entirely, and they have some of the most fascinating doors to nowhere in the country. The parish church was the center of life in rural Quebec for more than 2 centuries. It was not just a place of worship. It was the community hall, the courthouse, the polling station, the social center, and the repository of community identity. The church was typically the largest and most expensive building in the parish, and its construction was a communal effort that could take years or even decades to complete. The churches of Quebec were built in a distinctive style that evolved over the centuries, from the simple wooden chapels of the earliest settlements to the ornate stone churches of the 19th century. The classic Quebec church has a silver-painted tin roof, a facade with 1 or 2 towers, a long nave, and an apse at the east end that houses the altar. Many of them also have doors on their upper levels that serve no apparent purpose. Some of these doors are vestiges of construction phases. A church that was built in stages, with the nave completed first and the towers added later, might have a temporary entrance on the upper level that was used during construction and never removed. Others are access doors to bell towers, choir lofts, or organ galleries that were once reached by external staircases that have since been removed. But the most interesting church doors in Quebec are the ones associated with the charnier, the charnel house. As we discussed earlier, the frozen ground of Quebec made winter burial impossible, and the bodies of those who died in winter had to be stored until spring. Before the construction of separate charnel houses, the bodies were often stored in the church itself, in a vault beneath the floor, or in a room attached to the church. Some Quebec churches had a door specifically designated for the passage of coffins into the charnel space. This door was separate from the main entrance and from the side entrances used by the congregation. It was often located at a different level from the other doors, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, depending on the relationship between the church floor and the charnel vault. When the charnel house was located beneath the church, the coffin door might be at the basement level, set into the foundation wall, looking like a door that led into the earth. In churches, where the charnel space was in an upper room or loft, the coffin door was on the upper wall, accessible only from outside and only with a ladder or temporary scaffolding. These are the doors that survive as the most dramatic examples of the Quebec church. Door to nowhere. A door high on the stone wall of a 200-year-old church, surrounded by the carved saints and painted trim of the Quebec ecclesiastical style, opening onto the air above the churchyard where the summer sun falls on rows of ancient headstones. The symbolism is powerful, even if it was not intentionally crafted. The door above the churchyard, above the graves, above the earth, where the dead now lie permanently, was once the door through which those same dead passed on their way to temporary storage. It was a waypoint in the journey from life to burial, a pause in the process of returning the body to the ground. And now it stands open, or closed, or sealed above the completed graves, like a doorway in a dream that you cannot quite reach, and that opens onto a place you cannot quite remember. There is a church in the Charlevoix region, north of Quebec City, where the charnel door is still fitted with its original iron hinges and latch. The church is no longer used for regular worship, but is maintained as a heritage site. Visitors can climb a ladder to the charnel door and look through it into the small room beyond, now empty, now clean, now flooded with light from a window in the opposite wall. It is just a room. But knowing what was stored there, knowing that the bodies of parishioners who died in the winters of 1790 and 1810 and 1830 lay in this room for months at a time, waiting for the spring, gives the space a quality that no amount of scrubbing and whitewashing can entirely remove. Part 19. The Newfoundland Outports. We have not yet spoken about Newfoundland, and that is an oversight because the outport communities of Newfoundland have some of the most remarkable examples of doors to nowhere anywhere in Canada. Newfoundland was not part of Canada until 1949. For most of its European history, it was a separate colony governed directly from Britain, and its people developed a culture and an architectural tradition that were distinct from anything on the mainland. The outports, the small fishing communities scattered along the rugged coastline, were the backbone of Newfoundland life. Some of them were accessible only by boat. Some of them were home to a dozen families. Some of them had been occupied continuously since the 16th century, making them among the oldest European settlements in the Americas. The architecture of the outports was shaped entirely by two things: fish and weather. The houses were built of wood, because wood was abundant, and stone construction required skills and tools that were not readily available in small coastal communities. They were small, tight, and well sealed against the wind, which in Newfoundland is not a seasonal inconvenience, but a permanent condition of existence. The wind blows in Newfoundland the way water runs downhill. It does not stop. It does not rest. It is always there, pushing against the walls, rattling the shutters, finding every crack and gap and unsealed joint in the building. The Outport house typically had 1.5 or 2 stories, with a steep roof to shed snow and rain. The lower floor was the living space. The upper floor under the eaves was used for storage and sometimes for sleeping, and many of these houses had a door on the upper level, on the gable end facing the water, that opened onto the air above the steep slope that ran down to the shore. In some outports, this door was connected to a system of stages and flakes, the wooden platforms and drying racks that were used to process and dry codfish, the economic foundation of Newfoundland life. The stages were built on stilts above the waterline, and they sometimes extended up the slope to the level of the upper floor of the house. In these cases, the upper floor door was a direct connection between the house and the fish processing area. A woman could pass dried fish from the flake through the upper door into the house for storage without carrying it down to the ground level and back up the interior stairs. But many Outport houses had upper floor doors that were not connected to any stage or flake. They simply opened onto the slope. And the explanation for these doors is a combination of the practical and the cultural. Practically, the upper floor door was sometimes the only way to get large objects into and out of the upper floor, because the interior staircase in an Outport house was typically narrow, steep, and built more like a ladder than a proper stairway. Furniture, bedding, storage chests, barrels of provisions, all of these had to be moved through the upper floor door because they simply would not fit through the interior passage. Culturally, there was a tradition in some Outport communities that a coffin should leave the house through a different door than the one used by the living. This belief, which has parallels in Scottish, Irish, and West Country English folk traditions, held that the dead should not pass through the same threshold as the living, lest they draw the living out with them. The upper floor door, which was not normally used for daily coming and going, served as the funeral exit. The coffin was lowered through the upper door on ropes, slid down the slope, and carried to the graveyard, which in most Outports was on the highest point of land, the place where the wind blew strongest and the view of the sea was clearest. This practice was documented by folklorists who visited the Outports in the early and mid-20th century, before many of the communities were abandoned during the resettlement programs of the 1950s and 1960s. The folklorists recorded the belief in detail, and several noted that the upper floor door was explicitly referred to by Outport residents as the dead door or the passing door. It was not a door that was used casually or frequently. It was reserved for specific occasions, and those occasions were almost always connected to death. When the resettlement programs forced many Outport families to leave their communities and move to larger towns, some of them took their houses with them. This was not uncommon in Newfoundland. A wooden house could be floated on pontoons or oil drums from one community to another, and many families chose to move their house rather than build a new one. The houses that were moved in this way sometimes ended up in locations where the upper floor door made no sense at all. A door that had opened onto a slope running down to the sea now opened onto a flat lot in a town. A door that had been connected to a fish processing stage now opened onto a neighbor's fence. And so Newfoundland acquired a new category of door, to nowhere, a door that had once led somewhere very specific, but that had been literally moved away from the place it was designed for. These transplanted doors are among the saddest of all Canada's doors to nowhere, because they are not just architectural remnants. They are evidence of displacement. They are doors that remember a community that no longer exists, a way of life that was deliberately ended by government policy, a home that was picked up and carried away from the place where it belonged. Some of the older residents of the resettlement towns can still tell you which community their house came from and what the upper floor door was used for. But as that generation passes, the knowledge goes with them, and the doors become just doors, mysterious and unexplained, opening onto the parking lots and back gardens of towns that were not their original home. Part 20. The Doors of the Red River Settlement. Before we conclude this long journey through Canada's architectural history, there is one more region that deserves attention, and that is the Red River Settlement, the community that grew up around the junction of the Red and Assiniboine rivers in what is now Winnipeg, Manitoba. The Red River Settlement was one of the most unusual communities in Canadian history. Founded in 1812 by Lord Selkirk as an agricultural colony, it grew over the following decades into a polyglot community of Scottish settlers, French-Canadian fur traders, Métis families, retired Hudson's Bay Company employees, and missionaries of various Christian denominations. The community was governed by the Hudson's Bay Company, which exercised a monopoly over trade in the region, and its architecture reflected the diverse origins of its residents. The houses along the Red River were built in a variety of styles. The French-Canadian families built in the Red River frame style, a variation of the poteau sur sol construction used in the fur trade, with vertical logs set into a sill and the walls whitewashed with lime. The Scottish families built in the log construction style they had learned in the Canadian bush, sometimes augmented with features from the stone building tradition they remembered from Scotland. The Métis families built in a style that combined elements of both, along with features borrowed from indigenous building practices, particularly the use of buffalo hides and birch bark for waterproofing and insulation. Many of these houses had doors on their upper floors, and the reasons were as varied as the community itself. The French-Canadian houses used upper floor doors for grain storage, just as their relatives along the St. Lawrence did. The Scottish houses sometimes had vestigial hay loft doors from the Croft House tradition, and the Métis houses had upper floor doors that were used for a purpose unique to the Red River settlement, the storage and curing of pemmican. Pemmican was the essential food of the fur trade and of the plains life that the Métis straddled. It was made from dried buffalo meat, pounded into a powder and mixed with melted fat and sometimes berries. Packed into rawhide bags, pemmican could last for years and provided a concentrated, portable source of nutrition that was indispensable for long-distance travel by canoe or by dog sled. The making and storage of pemmican was a major industry in the Red River settlement, and the upper floors of Métis houses were often used as pemmican storerooms. The upper floor door allowed the heavy rawhide bags of pemmican to be hoisted in and out using ropes, and the elevation of the storeroom kept the pemmican away from dogs, which would eat through a wall to get at the stuff, and from the spring flooding that periodically inundated the low-lying land along the rivers. The Red River settlement was also subject to what may be the most dramatic natural threat to any community in Canadian history: flooding. The Red River floods regularly and sometimes catastrophically, and the spring floods of the 19th century could raise the water level by 20 or 30 feet, submerging entire communities for weeks at a time. The flood of 1826, which occurred just 14 years after the settlement was founded, was the largest on record, and it literally washed away most of the buildings in the community. After the 1826 flood, the settlers who rebuilt along the river made a point of putting doors on the upper floors of their houses, not for storage but for escape. When the water rose, a family could retreat to the upper floor, open the upper floor door, and step directly into a boat or a canoe. The door that opened onto nothing in normal times opened onto several feet of water during a flood, and a door that opens onto water is a door that opens onto survival. This flood door tradition continued in the Red River settlement and its successor, the city of Winnipeg, well into the late 19th century. Some of the older buildings in Winnipeg's Exchange District, the commercial heart of the city in the late 1800s, and early 1900s have upper floor doors that were installed specifically as flood exits, though they have not been used for that purpose since the construction of the Red River floodway in the 1960s diverted flood waters around the city. The flood doors of the Red River settlement are perhaps the most poignant of all Canada's doors to nowhere, because they were doors that were built for an emergency that everyone knew would come, but that nobody could predict. They were doors of last resort. They were the door you hoped you would never have to use, but that you put there anyway, because you knew what the river could do, and you wanted to be ready when it did it. There is something profoundly Canadian about that. Building for the disaster you know is coming, preparing for the worst while hoping for the best, putting a door on your second floor that opens onto nothing, on the understanding that someday when the water rises and the ground floor is submerged and the ice is cracking and the current is pulling at the foundation of your house, that door will be the most important door you have ever opened. The door to nowhere will become the door to everything. The door to life. Part 21. The Pacific Coast. We have traveled from east to west across Canada, but we have not yet reached the Pacific, and the buildings of British Columbia have their own contribution to make to this story. British Columbia was settled by Europeans later than the rest of Canada. The first permanent European settlement on the Pacific coast was Fort Victoria, established by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1843, more than 200 years after the founding of Quebec. The gold rush of 1858 brought a sudden influx of people, and the colony grew rapidly, but its architectural history is compressed into a shorter time span than any other region of the country. The oldest surviving buildings in British Columbia are concentrated in Victoria, in the Fraser Valley, and in the mining towns of the interior, places like Barkerville, Yale, and Fort Langley. And some of these buildings have doors that lead to nowhere, though the reasons are different from the eastern examples we have been discussing. In Victoria, the oldest surviving commercial buildings date from the 1860s and 1870s, and many of them were built in brick, a material that was relatively new to the Pacific coast. These commercial buildings followed patterns imported from San Francisco and from the eastern United States, and they included the standard loading doors on upper floors that were common to warehouse and commercial architecture throughout North America at that time. But Victoria also has a feature that is unique to the Pacific coast: doors that open onto what were once wooden sidewalks at a level higher than the current street. In the early days of Victoria, before the streets were graded and paved, the ground level was uneven and often muddy, and wooden sidewalks were built at various heights to provide a passable route through the commercial district. Buildings were constructed with their entrances at the level of these wooden sidewalks, and when the sidewalks were later removed and the streets were graded to a uniform level, some of those entrances ended up above the new street grade, becoming doors that opened onto a drop of 2 or 3 or even 4 feet. These are not dramatic doors to nowhere. They do not have the romance of the coffin doors of Quebec or the pathos of the flood doors of the Red River, but they are doors that lead to nowhere, or at least to somewhere that no longer exists, and they illustrate the same principle that we have seen throughout this entire journey, that buildings remember the landscape they were built for, even when that landscape changes around them. In the interior of British Columbia, the mining towns have their own category of mysterious door. The general stores and supply warehouses that served the mining communities were designed to receive goods that arrived by pack train, by wagon, and later by rail, and they often had loading doors on multiple levels to accommodate the different modes of delivery. A door at ground level for wagon deliveries, a door at a lower level for goods unloaded from pack animals on a sloping road, a door at an upper level for goods hoisted by crane from a rail siding. When the mines closed and the pack train stopped running and the railway was rerouted or abandoned, these doors lost their purpose. The general store became a residence or a tourist shop. The warehouse became a museum or a community center. And the doors remained, monuments to an economy that had vanished, to a system of transportation that had been superseded, to a way of moving goods through space that had been rendered obsolete by trucks and highways and the inexorable march of what we call progress. Barkerville, the restored gold rush town in the Caribou Mountains, preserves several buildings with these vestigial loading doors. The town, which was the largest settlement north of San Francisco, during the gold rush of the 1860s, was almost completely destroyed by fire in 1868 and was rebuilt immediately, and many of the rebuilt structures are still standing. Walking through Barkerville today is like walking through a museum of mid-19th century commercial architecture, and the loading doors on the upper floors of the stores and warehouses are among the most visible reminders that this was once a working town, not a tourist attraction. Fort Langley, near Vancouver, is another site where the doors tell the story of the building's original purpose. The fort was a Hudson's Bay Company trading post established in 1827, and the reconstructed buildings include a storehouse with a loading door on the upper floor that faces the Fraser River. The door was used to receive bales of salmon, which were packed in salt in barrels and shipped to markets in Hawaii, Asia, and South America. The salmon trade was one of the earliest export industries of the Pacific Coast, and the loading door at Fort Langley is a physical reminder of a time when Canadian salmon was salted and barreled and shipped across the Pacific in wooden sailing ships. The Pacific Coast buildings are the youngest of all the buildings we have discussed, and their doors to nowhere are the most recently created, but they carry the same essential quality as the 300-year-old doors of Quebec. They are traces. They are evidence. They are the marks left on a building by the life that was lived in it, and they persist long after the life itself has ended. Part 22. What the Doors Teach Us. We have been walking through Canadian history for a long time now, opening doors and looking through them, and it is time to step back and think about what we have seen. The doors to nowhere in Canada's oldest buildings are, individually, small things. A door is just a door, a hole in a wall with a piece of wood fitted to it. It is not grand architecture. It is not monumental. It is not the kind of thing that makes the cover of an architecture magazine or draws busloads of tourists. But collectively, these doors tell a story that is larger than any single building. They tell the story of how people adapted to a land that was not designed for them. They tell the story of improvisation, of making do, of solving problems with whatever materials and knowledge were available. They tell the story of death, which was constant and intimate, and handled with a practicality that modern sensibilities might find shocking. And they tell the story of hope, of doors built for buildings that were never constructed, of openings made in anticipation of a prosperity that might or might not arrive. The doors also tell us something about the relationship between architecture and memory. A building remembers its past through the features that remain after the original reasons for them are gone. A door that was built to load grain remembers the harvest. A door that was built to receive coffins remembers the dead. A door that was built to connect to a barn that was never built remembers the intention, the plan, the optimism of a person who believed that next year would be better than this one. This is what architecture does that history books cannot. A history book can tell you that the infant mortality rate in New France was 25%, but a door through which tiny coffins were lifted on winter nights makes you feel it. A history book can tell you that the Loyalists left the American colonies after the Revolution, but a door on the second floor of a house in Kingston, built for a connected farmstead that was never completed, shows you what it meant to start over in the wilderness with nothing but a memory of what you had lost. And so the doors are valuable, not because they are beautiful or rare or architecturally significant in the conventional sense, but because they are honest. They are the places where buildings tell the truth about the lives that were lived in them. They are the seams in the fabric of the past, the places where the neat surface tears, and you can see through to the complicated, messy, frightening, hopeful reality underneath. If you ever find yourself standing in front of one of these doors, staring up at it, wondering why it is there, know that you are asking the right question. And know that the answer, whatever it turns out to be, will tell you something true about the country you are standing in and about the people who built it. One stone and one board, and one stubborn, inexplicable door at a time. Part 23. A Final Walk. Let us take one last walk. It is evening. We are in Quebec City, in the old town, in the narrow streets that wind between stone buildings that have stood for centuries. The light is going. The lamps are coming on. The cobblestones are wet from an afternoon rain, and they reflect the lamplight in long, golden streaks. We walk along Rue de Petit Champlain, which claims to be the oldest commercial street in North America. The buildings on either side are tall and narrow, built of stone, with steep roofs and tiny windows. Some of them have been converted to shops and restaurants, their ground floors opened up and filled with light and noise. But their upper floors are still original, still stone, still pierced by the narrow doors that were put there 300 years ago. We turn up the hill, climbing the wooden stairs that connect the lower town to the upper town. The stairs are steep, and our breath comes harder as we climb. At the top, we turn and look back down over the rooftops of the lower town, across the river, to the south shore where the land rises gently to the Appalachian Mountains. The view is the same view that Champlain saw when he stood here in 1608. The buildings are different. The ships in the harbor are different, but the river and the mountains and the sky are the same. We walk along Rue Saint-Louis, past the Chateau Frontenac, past the Governor's Garden, past the old garrison buildings. We pass the Maison Jacques, and we look up at the door on the upper floor, the door that has opened onto nothing for nearly 350 years. The door is closed tonight. The stone around it is dark with age. The iron hardware is rusted almost to nothing, but the door is still there. We continue to the ramparts, the old defensive walls that ring the upper town. We walk along the top of the wall, looking out over the plains of Abraham, where the battle that decided the fate of a continent was fought in less than an hour on a September morning in 1759. The plain is dark now, a park, empty and quiet. The only light comes from the street lamps along the avenue that crosses it. We walk until we reach the citadel, the massive fortress that sits on the highest point of the promontory. The citadel is still an active military installation, home to the Royal 22nd Regiment, and its walls are closed to visitors at this hour. But we can see, on the stone walls of the outer fortifications, the dark rectangles of doors that have not been opened in a century or more, ammunition loading doors, observation ports, emergency exits that exit onto cliffs, doors that led somewhere once and lead nowhere now. We stand there for a while, in the dark, looking at the doors. The wind comes off the river, carrying the smell of salt and pine. Somewhere below us, in the lower town, a church bell strikes the hour. The sound rolls up the cliff face and over the ramparts and fades into the night. And we think about all the doors we have visited tonight, the grain doors of the St. Lawrence Valley, the coffin doors that receive the winter dead, the spirit traps of the maritime churches, the observation doors of the fur trade bastions, the optimistic doors of the loyalist houses, the execution doors of the garrison towns, the charnel doors of the Quebec churches, the loading doors of the ice houses, the passage doors of the hospitals, the dead doors of the Newfoundland outports, the flood doors of the Red River, the sidewalk doors of Victoria, the salmon doors of Fort Langley. Every one of them was built for a reason. Every one of them made sense to the person who put it there, and every one of them, in the fullness of time, lost the thing it was connected to. The staircase, or the ramp, or the building, or the landscape, or the way of life that gave it purpose, and became a door that opens onto nothing. But nothing is the wrong word. These doors do not open onto nothing. They open onto history. They open onto the accumulated experience of 400 years of human habitation in a vast, cold, beautiful, difficult country. They open onto the ingenuity of people who solve problems with the materials at hand. They open onto the grief of people who stored their dead above their heads because the ground would not receive them. They open onto the faith of people who built doors between this world and whatever lies beyond it. They open onto the hope of people who put a door in a wall for a building they had not yet built, on the assumption that the future would be generous enough to let them build it. That is not nothing. That is everything. The doors are still there. They have always been there. They will be there tomorrow and next year and 100 years from now, if the buildings stand and the stones hold, and nobody decides that a door to nowhere is a problem that needs solving. They are not problems. They are answers. Answers to questions we forgot to ask, about grain and coffins, and winter cold and optimism and death, and the sheer relentless, beautiful stubbornness of people who build doors even when there is nowhere for them to go. Good night, sleep well, and if you dream of doors tonight, know that you are in good company. People have been dreaming of these doors for 300 years. The doors do not mind. They are patient. They have nowhere else to be, and neither do you, not right now. Right now, you are here, wherever here is, and the night is around you, and the words are slowing down, and the doors are closing, one by one, softly, without sound, the way doors close in old houses when the wind changes direction and the air pressure shifts and the latch finds the catch without anyone touching it. The grain door closes, and behind it is the sweet dusty smell of wheat that was harvested in a September that no one alive remembers. The coffin door closes, and behind it is the silence of a winter that ended 300 years ago, when the ground finally softened and the bodies were carried down the hill to the churchyard and the priest said the words, and the earth took back what belonged to it. The spirit door closes, and whatever was on the other side of it, whether it was evil or nothing, or just the wind, stays on the other side where it belongs. The flood door closes, and the river recedes, and the water goes back to where it came from, and the settlement dries out and goes on. The dead door closes, and the coffin slides down the Newfoundland hillside toward the graveyard on the headland where the wind never stops, and the sea never stops, and the grass grows thick and green over the graves of people who lived their entire lives within sight and sound of the water. All the doors are closing now, the loading doors and the observation doors and the optimistic doors and the doors that were built for buildings that never came. They are closing quietly, the way old things end, not with drama, but with a settling, a easing, a gradual lessening of tension as the hinges relax and the wood finds its resting place against the frame. The last door closes, and behind it there is nothing but sleep. Good, deep Canadian sleep. The kind of sleep that comes after a long day of walking through old buildings and asking questions that do not have simple answers. The kind of sleep that settles over you like snow, softly, steadily, covering everything, smoothing every edge, filling every gap until the whole world is quiet and white and still. Sleep now. The doors will keep.